All right, I'm gonna go ahead and let everybody in now.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session, We Need to Talk. I'm Miranda Kramer, and I'm the District Controller at Buffalo Hanover Montrose Schools, and I'll be serving as today's moderator. In just a moment, I'm going to introduce our presenter, but first, a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions, please go ahead and submit those using our chat feature. We will be monitoring that as well, but you can use your audio and video in this session as well. Also, use the chat feature if you're having any technical difficulties. Please note our session is recorded, so post-conference you'll be able to find our session in the Learning Center. Now I'd like to welcome today's speaker, Daniel Ludvigson. We're excited for you to join us and present on the topic, We Need to Talk.
Thank you very much, and I'm glad that MASBO thought I did good enough last time to invite me back a second time. So I appreciate all the feedback that was given last time. It really is an honor to be doing this again. I had a period of time where I wasn't able to, and this is my presentation, We Need to Talk, which is a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek reference to like perhaps when you hear your spouse say, we need to talk, and that feeling of dread of, oh, what did I do now? But this presentation goes into those times where there might be an unmet expectation, and because of that, you have a conversation that maybe doesn't feel the most comfortable. And the materials for this presentation largely come from Crucial Accountability and Crucial Conversations. Highly recommend it. Back when I was in North Dakota, the ND Lead Center did several trainings on both of these books, and they were very good. They're one of the few books I've read three times a piece. The book Now We Are Talking by Justin Bader from the Principal Center is also a fairly good book for those who do sit down with evaluations and things like that. So the first part of We Need to Talk is conversations start before you ever actually have the conversation. And these 4 items are ways to identify maybe some potential pitfalls or risks that you might have if they're not present. So a good conversation, a good relationship has these elements. First is safety. Do you feel safe talking to the person? Do you feel like the information is going to stay with them? Do you feel like you're going to be retaliated against? Those sorts of things. You feel safe talking. if you feel like the information is going to stay in that conversation and that you can share it without fear of some sort of reprise or retaliation. Respect is the sense that the other person values your opinion. Like if you are a teacher, that you respect that you know what you're doing about, say, language arts, if you're a language art teacher. And if you don't feel respect, you tend to feel like the other person is dismissing what you have to say, isn't really listening, because perhaps you get the sense that they seem to think they know more than you. Purpose. Purpose is the one I always like to say that as school educators, we should, as people working in schools, that this should be the easiest one because we're all there for the kids. Even in the business office, what we're doing is trying to make sure resources and things are getting to the right places so we can provide good opportunities for children. And so a lot of times, purpose, if somebody feels like you have a different goal in mind or going a different direction, that can cause tension. And it's probably the easiest one to build during the conversation of talking about what you're trying to achieve and where you're trying to go with something. And trust. Trust is more than just that they can believe what you say. It's also that you're going to follow through on what you're going to say and that you're predictable. Trust is difficult if they never quite know what way you're going to blow, or if they feel like you say something but you just don't quite follow through on it. Obviously, trust involves being able to believe what you say. So those are 4 components. If you're having difficulty starting a positive, constructive conversation, a lot of times I go back to this and ask myself, is what the person's saying indicating to me a safety issue, a respect issue, purpose, or trust? Safety usually involves not feeling comfortable, feeling like things aren't going to stay in that conversation, worried about something that's going to happen. Respect, usually the person feels insulted in some way and will express that. Purpose is somebody's probably just going to say that like you're trying to accomplish something different. And trust, they'll indicate things like they don't really believe what's being said. So when you're in the conversation, paying close attention to what adjectives and verbs are used might give you an idea of if one of these are missing. And if you're mediating a conversation, you have the opportunity to kind of watch and see if what's being communicated indicates one or multiple of these problems. And so a crucial conversation generally involves either opposing opinions, strong emotions, high stake, or some combination of these. So opposing opinions, that's fairly simple. You don't agree on something. In particular, if the decision is particularly important, like there's major consequences, and that's where the high stakes come up. And these are a perception thing. So I like to use with strong emotions. If the issue is generating a lot of emotions, it's more likely to be a crucial conversation. I remember talking to a staff person once, and the core issue was like, a $10 or $15 fee on a electronic device for damage. And to them, the issue made them very upset. They were tense, turning a little bit shade of red. And even though it's like, to me, at the end of the day, the stakes weren't really that high. The opposing opinions probably weren't really that different. Her feelings about it were very strong. And if I went back to that list, the reason she felt strong about it was, for her, it was a respect issue. She wasn't being respected. And to her, it wasn't $15, $10. It was, I'm not being listened to. I'm not being valued. And unfortunately, our human brains aren't well designed to have a crucial conversation, because when our emotions start amping up, and generally if you are in one, emotions are going to run a little higher, your brain goes from your executive functions down into what they call your reptilian brain, which is basically you're going to want to fight, flight, or freeze, none of which are particularly helpful when you're trying to work through a difficult conversation. But the first part of this is focus on you first. You are the only person you can control. And that has 2 purposes. One, you're the only behavior that you can change. So you can't make somebody else behave in a certain way. You can't make somebody else think a certain thing. And if you try to control what other people are doing, you're going to be very frustrated. You're going to feel defeated. And those aren't good feelings. And a lot of times when I give these presentations, a lot of times people might be thinking something like, hey, I know somebody who could really use this advice. And if that's what you're thinking, pause. We start with, as they like to say, the man in the mirror first. So see, these are some of the things that you want to focus on to get yourself right first. The first one is you make you mad. And what your thoughts and feelings are about something lead into the second one. What they are, you're going to act on them, or you're either going to act on your feelings, or those feelings are going to bubble up at a time that maybe you don't want them to. So an example I like to use of some of these ideas is I heard this story as a part of a research study. And what they did was they went to each person and they said, hey, you are going on your way to bank, on your way to work, and it gets robbed. And they classified the responses they got from participants into 3 categories. The first was, oh, and you get shot. And the first was, what luck, I was at the bank and I got shot and I'm okay, I'm still okay. The second one was, what bad luck, I was at the bank and I got shot. Perfectly understandable. And the last one was, what horrible luck, there were so many more people deserving in that room to get shot than me. And I'm sure you can appreciate kind of the irony and the humor in that. And so that was one I've gone back to several times. And so get back to the facts. Say that you're stuck in traffic and you're sitting there thinking, hey, this person is being rude. They're completely inconsiderate. They're blocking me off. They're doing it on purpose. Those are all things you're telling yourself, and you get mad about that. Maybe the other person is hung up in traffic too. Maybe they really need to get to the hospital because they have a sick person in the vehicle or whatever it is. And you're there telling yourself a story about how inconsiderate and different things that they are, and you're getting upset, but those aren't really the facts you're getting upset about. The next one is own your role. So you're the only person, again, that can control. And so one of the things you need to do is say, how are you contributing to the conversation? How are you playing a role in why people are frustrated into the problem? Because that's the thing you can have the most impact on. And later, when you get into the actual conversations, it's really important that you own what your part in it is. Consider what may motivate a decent and rational person to do the thing that you're engaged in. And this is a little bit get back to the facts, but we often, our brains naturally want to attribute character flaws to people when we're upset and say, you know, this person's just mean, they have it out for me. And if you step back and you ask yourself, like, you know, if I was doing something like this, why would I do it? What's a rational explanation for this behavior? And that will get you away from those stories you tell in your own head. And that's why this slide is titled Master Your Stories, because those things we tell ourselves, eventually, if we don't kind of stop ourselves and check it, we begin to treat them like they're facts, they're truth. And I'm sure you can see that dynamic in like news these days quite a bit. And finally, know what you hope to accomplish. It's a pretty common problem to go into a conversation. And the example I'll use is one time I was talking to a parent and they were upset because their child was suspended, put in detention. And what they came after me was, what they told me was their other child, their son, was in trouble quite a bit. And so they had been suspended a few times. And what he was saying was, if this was my son, you would have suspended him. And I kind of paused him and I said, sir, are you advocating that I suspend your daughter? And he said, well, no. On his side of the fence, like he was losing what he was hoping to accomplish. He felt like his son was being treated differently. And what he was communicating to me didn't really match. So we often do that to ourselves. Say you're going to a conversation, you're very upset, and you throw everything you're mad about. Well, like you probably want to get to a resolution, and that's really not going to get you there by doing that. If you have questions as I'm going along, feel free to throw them in the chat. When we hit the reflection slides, I will pause and take a look at those. Before you head into a conversation, like the previous slide said, work on you first because you're the only person that you can really control. Make sure you know what you really want. Like I said, it's really easy to get off on a sidetrack, especially if you're really upset. It might be tempting to try to prove that you're right and they're wrong. Again, if you want the person's cooperation, fighting with them is not likely to get you there. And then the first new one on here is refuse the fool's choice. And what that is, we often justify negative behavior that we have by telling ourselves something along the lines of, it's the only way. If the only way that they'll listen is that I get loud and I get upset, maybe you tell yourself there's no point in saying anything, nothing ever gets done. And it's that sort of black and white, I have to do this either or nothing will happen. There's no point in doing this because nothing ever happens. It's usually a very absolute way of thinking. And a lot of times it's justifying you either acting in a way that's maybe not as appropriate as you would normally think, or not doing things or doing things that you wouldn't normally do unless you were telling yourselves those stories. So spot signs, the conversations has become crucial. And there's two parts to this. One is for yourself and one's for the other person. Paying attention to body language, if the person is tensing up, if their skin's changing color, if their tone of voice is raising. A lot of times, something that people will sometimes do is that their speech will either slow down or speed up. And usually with tone kind of gives you an idea if that's a sign that the person is getting upset or thinking really hard about something. It's really important that you're aware of your own response under stress, which I'll get into a little bit too. But a lot of times when you're in a crucial conversation, you may not know that it's going to become crucial, and you really need to, and maybe you do know that it's going to be an uneasy conversation, and you have to pay very close attention to who you're talking to, because how they're responding to you is information, and that information is very valuable for trying to determine how should I respond. Should I use this tool or that tool? And if you're only focused on what you want to say and only what you want, you might miss the cues you're getting from the other individual. Check that safety is at risk. A lot of the strategies I'm talking about are to keep the person talking. So one of the things with crucial conversations, and especially for those that do administrative roles or perhaps are trying to tell people a rule that is fairly fixed, or they just don't believe something's going to change, is that a lot of times people will just shut down. And these strategies try to keep them talking so that you can learn about what's making them upset, like, potentially what aspect of a good relationship is missing, of a good conversation is missing, to figure out what they're trying to get at and what they really believe. Because a lot of times when people are upset, they might not give you their honest opinion. Like if they're upset about something happening, like they're upset with a teacher and how they're disciplining, they might focus on homework or something else instead. And if you don't get them talking, they'll give you a reason, but it might not actually be the real reason because they don't feel comfortable sharing it, or they will say nothing at all, so you don't learn about like a potential problem or what's really getting at there. So pay attention to safety as at risk, because when you sense a person doesn't feel comfortable sharing, what you need to focus on is first creating that sense that yes, you want to hear what their opinion is, which if you're going to use these strategies, a good thing to keep in mind is that you may hear things you don't want to hear. You may have to listen to things that make you upset. And to get through it and have a positive result, sometimes you have to let people vent. So again, pay attention to safety is at risk and your response under stress. So if your tone of voice raises, maybe you tap, If you know it's going to be a hard conversation, it's not a bad idea to have a friend and tell them to kick you under the table if you're getting out of line. And a strategy I sometimes use if I know that I'm going to be in a pretty high emotional state is I might tap or something like that because I'll naturally speed up if I'm getting agitated. And sometimes having strategies like that to kind of act as a built-in barometer that you're getting agitated helps you to like pull yourself back to consciously decide to regulate your emotions. Again, having a friend that can kind of bump you until you take a pause is also an effective thing. So stop and reflect. Here is a scenario. You can either read it, but like what I'd like you to do is drop in the chat. What do you see that are the facts, and what do you think are the components of a missing missing positive relationship? Your business official, your school board just had a split 3-3 vote on involving a program that is popular with some families but carries long-term financial risk. One board member abstained, saying they need more financial clarity before supporting the motion. During the meeting, you notice that this board member seems disengaged. They're checking their phone, whispering with another member, and visibly frustrated as you walk through fund balance projections and budget assumptions. You finish your presentation professionally, but the vote stalls. Later that evening, you overhear the same board member say, "I just don't trust the numbers we're being given." The next morning, they post on social media. That's the part that we all get excited when somebody takes their opinion on the World Wide Web. Our taxpayers deserve transparency and accountability. We shouldn't rush decisions when financial questions haven't been fully answered. They don't name you, but the timing is unmistakable. By noon, community members are sharing the post. Staff begin asking whether the district's finances are stable. The principal stops by your office asking if a levy is coming. So what are the actual facts of what's happening? What component of a positive conversation are missing that you see? Again, if you see what they are, drop them in the chat. And so what do you think? And then we'll end with what's the fool's choice? I don't see too much activity, so if somebody prefers to come off mute and share some of their thoughts, that works too. So like as you're saying there, they're saying details are missing.
I just don't think I can type fast enough. So for me, the facts are we feel there's someone who's not feeling like they don't have all the information that they need. The component to good conversation that is missing is he doesn't feel safe enough to come directly to that person, to talk with them directly, to get the information that they're needing.
Yes, and I would say there's a component of trust too, and so that's very good. Like they don't feel safe enough to speak up at the meeting, so very good for catching that. Anybody else interested in coming off mute? I don't see a lot of activity in the chat, so I also have what's the fool's choice in this scenario, which was my intended more of the discussion portion of it. What could you be telling yourself that might encourage you to maybe act irrationally? Yes, you don't want to fire back on social media because like just that's my advice in general. Like If you ever respond with something on social media, it should just be your own story, independent of anybody's particular comment. I think it's also risky to assume that they don't respect you unless you have that background information. And it might be like they were saying earlier, more of a personal issue that they're feeling. I'll have another one of these sorts of activities a little bit later. So I'm going to keep going because it seems like don't want the conversation to bog down here. Okay, watch for safety signs are at risk. Again, learn to pay attention. And again, if you have responses to that reflection, still throw them out in the chat. Dialogue is great. Watch for safety signs. So I remember one pretty distinct one where I was visiting with a parent and they were saying, it's fine. They were actually pretty calm in the way they were talking and the word choices, but their face was turning bright red. So I eventually asked them, I eventually said, you don't look fine. And I'll get more into that later. And they ended up opening up. And, tension in the body shows a lot. Just be careful of reading too much into warning signs. People are a lot better at reading that something is wrong or amiss and not lining up. And we are not as good at reading what the actual intention or purpose is. We might figure out that something's not being said or not quite something's missing, but we're not very good lie detectors for the most part and things like that. And kind of the big thing is don't ignore those things because a lot of these strategies, you can also harm the strategy by barreling past it or miss an opportunity to understand what's going on by not evaluating what the words are against the body language. And so if you're familiar with some signs of what makes a person, like what you see in a person when they seem to be getting upset, throw them in the chat. It's great to share. But these are some strategies that you might see, and they're classified in either silence or violence. And violence just means the person becomes aggressive and more on the offensive, where silence is a way of shutting down. And people vary in which one that they tend to rely on, and it can vary depending on the circumstances. So I know overall, I'm more likely to fall into silence, but there are situations in which I might get more agitated and more on the offensive. And it pays to know which one you tend to rely on and why you might switch from one mode to the other. A lot of times, if somebody's engaging in more violent strategies, there's usually a personal, a strong emotion. Perhaps they feel like they're not respected, those sorts of things. But masking is simply pretending you're okay with something. The example I like to use is saying, that is a fantastic idea. Let's get right on that. And then promptly going back to your room and doing it the same old way. You're not engaging in the person. You don't want to have a conflict. You don't maybe feel safe sharing your honest opinion. So you just pretend to be okay with it. But you really have a different opinion. You're just not sharing it. Avoiding. I've had the pleasure of being out on the street and watching somebody stop and walk across and then continue walking from the other side. I won't say I've never done that myself, but avoiding can be things like that or changing the subject. You don't want to address the conversation. Usually it's kind of like you don't feel safe talking about it, so you just want to change it to something else. Withdrawing is shutting down. You're either not talking or maybe you're just yeah, okay, fine, whatever. Usually that is some sort of feeling like it doesn't matter what I do anyway, so there's no point in having a conversation. And withdrawing and masking in particular are easy to kind of in the moment be like, okay, the person's not actively disagreeing with me. They're not actively combating me. We'll just keep going ahead. But those are times to stop. Again, violence, these are more like the person comes more aggressive. Controlling has to do with maybe somebody's monologuing or they're talking over somebody. They're saying, you need to do this or else. Like they're trying to control the conversation. Labeling is a strategy where it's pretty much name calling or stereotyping. Everybody from that department only cares about sports. They never care about anything else. It's kind of all inclusive language, and you're dismissing the argument based on just kind of labeling something good or bad, essentially. Attacking, for this slide, what that means is like calling names, like you never support anything I do. You know nothing about what you're talking about. You're pretty much, it's a lot of times you're not even talking about the issue anymore. You're just attacking the person's personality, and definitely a sign of some respect and some of those issues we talked about. It's definitely a sign of something depending on what they articulate. And so it's important to know what you're prone to doing. If you know the person that you're having a crucial conversation with, it helps to be familiar with their responses and, you know, maybe be prepared for how you're going to handle them. Toolkits, apologize, own your own role. So first off, don't apologize for something you're not really apologetic for that comes across as fake and insincere. However, this goes back to own your own role. If you contributed by getting upset and raising your voice, you acknowledge that. Like, hey, I realize I may have gotten a little bit emotional and raised my voice, but I really do care. What I really want is for this project to be successful, and I just don't feel like what we're doing right now is going to get us there. That's what apologizing is. Contrasts can be very effective. A lot of times, in particular, if you sense the person thinks you have a different purpose than you, say like, I don't want to target your child and make them feel like nothing they do is right. I want everybody on the bus to be safe. It's saying you try to say what you believe they think that your purpose is, that it isn't lining up with theirs, and then you follow it with what you believe your mutual purpose is. It's most effective if you know what the person is upset about and what they may be thinking your goals are. And then creating mutual purpose, there's different ways to do this. The books use the acronym CRIB. You can either create it in the conversation, say this is the purpose, this is the reason that you're moving towards it, this is the reason I'm moving towards it, so we're really working towards the same goal. Recognizing it, like I said earlier, you should all be here for the kids and making sure good, positive learning environment is occurring. Invent one sometimes if there's a little more frustration and the goals are a little different. Sometimes you engage the person in a conversation to figure out where you might have a mutual purpose, or you come up with one during the conversation. And brainstorming, similar to that, and that's more so if you're having a little bit harder time seeing how you might be on the same page. And I like the example of crossing arms there in the chat. Thank you very much. And leaning back, I like that combination because sometimes when people get cold, they'll cross their hands. Some people have more of a habit of doing it. Definitely if it's out of character. But that sort of leaning back or leaning in, that proximity to the person you're talking about can say a lot. If somebody puts something in between you, create separation, that kind of gives you hints. Right, we're going to start talking about some of the strategies we can use. Share the facts. So a lot of times the facts are usually the least emotionally charged. So I did this a lot as a principal, like when I had students in, they had a fight during recess, I would visit with each one. Okay, what do we agree happened? Because a lot of times what we fight about is probably the 20 or 10% that we don't agree on. So you start off with, this happened on such a day. So-and-so said this or that. Do we agree this happened? And a lot of times, if it's a tense conversation, I might just focus on that step, go through it and say, hey, do we agree that on all these things? And I try to stay away from anything that I know is contended at that time. because a lot of times it gives people time to calm down. And then you're starting from a place where you already have a mutual understanding. Everybody understands this happened. So it's a great starting point. And 2 and 3 can flip around. So telling your story is after you agreed on what the facts are, it's something like, okay, this is why I believe this is how I'm interpreting it. And you talk tentatively. So he'll say, hey, I think you're very frustrated because you feel disrespected. You think this is ignoring your opinion. And then you say, do I have that right? You give them an opportunity to give you feedback of, yes, you're on the right page. No, you're not. And then asking for the other person's path is, you say, here where what we agreed the facts are. Maybe you shared your story. Maybe you started with theirs. Like, how would you interpret it? The one I used, I will always remember, is one time I was talking to a staff member who was sending students to the counselor, and all the students had an issue with the principal, but none of the students asked to go visit the counselor. And so what I did was I said, I laid out all the facts. Susie was here. You asked Susie to go to the counselor. Susie didn't ask. Like, that happened, and I went from thing to thing. And then the person asked if I was accusing them of something, and I said no. But if you were me, how would you explain this information? What's your explanation for why you were doing this? And the person quit the next day, so I assume it wasn't a good explanation, as I like to joke. But you're asking them, like, give me a chance to understand where you're coming from. Give me a chance to understand why, with this information, you came to this conclusion. And encourage testing is like, particularly when you offer your opinion, you say, do I have that right? These are the facts. This is like, are you upset? Is that right? Encourage testing. When they share their story, perhaps you add, is this what you're saying to me? Do I have that right? And avoid falling into traps. It can be tempting to want to win the conversation or get stuck going off side tangents. A pretty common mistake people will get into is, say you're having a conversation with somebody because they're never on time, for example. That person gets really fixated that on yesterday they had a flat tire and there wasn't any way they could get to work. But this is the 12th time they've been late. So don't get hung up on the one time that they have an excuse for. Say, okay, if getting to work on time was important, you wouldn't have been late 12 times. So avoid getting pulled into too much of a specific. And sometimes when people are drilling down on details, they're really looking for a starting place or to validate some feeling they have. So if somebody's asking you 20 questions, sometimes pause, get back. Okay, what are we trying to understand here? So these are some strategies specifically for exploring the other person's path. And one is simply ask them for like what their story is, like I said before. The thing is, if you're in a crucial, tense conversation, the thing to keep in mind is they probably won't tell you. And that's why these other strategies exist. Mirror, I referred to that one earlier. I was talking to the parent and they were becoming red. And so what I did was I told them, sir, you don't look fine. You're turning a bright shade of red. I believe you're upset about something. And then they opened up that they were very frustrated that their child was doing poor in homework and they didn't feel like they're getting help or something of that nature. And that is an effective strategy I use a lot. I know one other time I said, hey, I see that you're taking out the trash. That's not your job. What's going on? And then the person opened up with being frustrated that, the trash wasn't being taken out. And so they're just going to do it themselves. But instead of saying what my opinion was, I'm pretty much just leave the door. Hey, I notice. So I'm letting the person know that I'm paying attention, but I give them the opportunity to give me their why. Paraphrase. The thing to be careful with paraphrase is don't repeat exactly what they said. What you want to use is your language of how you understand what's going on to restate something they said. And the reason you do that is, A, Repeating exactly what they say may come across as mocking, like you're parroting them. But also, we tend to use language differently. And the example I often like to use is that in my household, sometimes when somebody says table, they mean any flat surface. And so when somebody tells me table, I think strictly table. And so if they tell me to go get the knife from the table, I'm looking all over because it's on the kitchen counter. We meant different things, even though we use the similar words. And then prime. Prime is one you use when you're sensing that the conversation is not opening up, that the person is upset, but they're not telling you why. And it comes from like prime the pump. So you take a guess at why that person's upset. They've shut down, they're withdrawing, they're avoiding. And you're saying, like, here's the story. This is what I'm seeing. Perhaps do you think that I want your program to fail and that's why you're not talking to me and you're upset? Um, do you think that I think you're a terrible parent and that's why you're upset with me? And the reason you do that is you're trying to get them to talk about it. And the reason this isn't the first thing you go to, obviously, if you're guessing at why the person's upset, you have the option of being wrong about it and maybe causing a different problem because that wasn't at all what they're upset about. But I have used it from time to time, and it can be effective to get the person talking. And so I have another scenario, and for this, type one word in the chat, one word or short phrase. What do you notice first about this situation? What seems to be the important information? And do you notice any masking, avoiding, withdrawing, controlling, labeling, or attacking type of behavior? You're wrapping up your workday and stopping at the grocery store to grab a few things. As you turn down an aisle, a staff member from the district recognizes you and walks over. Before you can greet them, they begin speaking quickly, emotionally, and without pause. Nothing ever gets approved anymore. It feels like finance just shuts everything down. You thank them for stopping to talk and start to ask what they're referring to, but they continue, sort of like cutting you off. I've submitted multiple requisitions this year, and it's always the same thing. More questions, more delays. We're told to be innovative, but then we're blocked at every turn. I already talked to my supervisor, and nothing changes. I figured if I talked to you directly, maybe someone would finally listen. They start listing examples: a purchase that was flagged, a spending pattern that was questioned, a request that required additional justification. As they talk, they begin referencing other departments, past years, and what they describe as a pattern of finance, not trusting staff to make decisions. You notice their voice rising and their frustration spilling into the conversation. Other shoppers nearby pretend not to listen, but you can feel the attention in the space. You feel pressure to explain the budget, defend the controls, or clarify policy, but you also sense that this moment isn't really about a single requisition. You realize this conversation isn't about spending requests, it's about trust, respect, and whether this staff member believes their professional judgment is valued. So what are we noticing? Again, if you feel more comfortable just popping off mute. But if you notice important information there, throw it in the chat. The other question I have with this slide is, how do you keep the person talking in a constructive way? How do you lower the temperature and build a shared meaning with them? What are some tools that might work in this situation? That is a great one. The lean in and talk quietly. That is a great strategy. If you lower your own voice, a lot of times people mirror you. That's a great one. Yep, scheduling a different time to visit. Because, yeah, the grocery store has a lot of ears. Asking them for solutions. Yeah, the person wants to be heard. The scenario is very much about no one listens to me, which they're really conveying like a sense of like a lack of respect from their perspective. Yep, acknowledging they came to you, they were indicating that um, that no one was listening. So obviously they were hoping that you would provide a listening ear. Thank you. I appreciate that. Giving the person a chance to provide a possible solution. A lot of times, if you preface that with, hey, let's think together on this, and you offer some sort of information to help get to a conclusion that helps, um, I'd be careful of like strictly just saying, hey, what's your solution? As depending on the person's experience, they might take that as avoidance on their end, like that you don't really want to talk about it. So you're putting it back in their court. Thank you. Let's see. Okay, I'm gonna briefly touch on it's important to like know how decisions are being made. So like when you're communicating with somebody, either like going into the decision making process or as you're talking in the conversation, you find out a decision needs to be made. Know which one that you need to do. So who cares about the situation? Make sure you identify that. Who knows about it? Who must agree? And who has important information? So those are the people that are involved in decisions. So command, that's the first one. And that one's like you need to make the decision like it's an emergency, it's a crisis, the building's on fire. You don't ask for people's opinion. If you're the one that's being the leader at the time, you tell them what to do and you act. You don't stop to see who agrees with you. Consult you use when you ultimately make the decision, but like you need to have information from people to make an informed decision. And it's really important to be clear on this. So if you're in a conversation and you're getting feedback, kind of like in the scenario that we just did, where chances are you have to have some financial decision to make or approval process. Like when I do a calendar, for example, I do a survey to get people's input, but I always put in there, this is not a voting mechanism. We're not going to just do whatever gets the most votes, but being very clear makes the person feel like they heard, they have a voice. Voting, perhaps the decision is such that you're doing a democratic process. We're going to do whatever everybody agrees to. Again, being very clear what you're doing. And consensus is only one you use in high stakes. For example, I used this one once when selecting a reading curriculum with teachers. And the reason I used consensus was I need everybody in on it. So if 6 out of 10 of my teachers are invested, gung ho, and then the other 4 just aren't invested and they're doing minimal effort, chances are the overall implementation of that reading program is not going to be very effective. And so I had a situation where I actually agreed with one of the staff members that wanted to go with a more, we'll say, innovative, more modern reading curriculum that used strategies that I thought were highly effective as well. We ultimately went with what everybody could agree to, And I ended up sitting this person down and having crucial conversation like, hey, you may be confused because I agree with you, but this is the reason that we did this decision because we need everybody to be behind it. So as we're getting more towards the end here, make sure you agree where you'd agree. I kind of alluded to it earlier, but a lot of times we'll argue the most intensely about the 10 or 20% that we disagree on, but not take time to acknowledge the 90 or 80% we do agree on. So a good example I have of this is fortunately one time I did a survey before a staff meeting regarding a reading incentive program. And the reason I did that was I wanted to know where we already agreed. And when I came to the staff meeting, one of the people had like a speech ready, multiple pages about why they thought we needed to do this or that. And I opened it with like, hey, this is where we agree. Let's establish that first, and then we'll talk about where we don't agree. And the person actually was like, oh, we actually agree on this. I don't need to go through this whole speech. And we have avoided what could have potentially been kind of a tense conversation because we established, no, we agree on this. So like, we don't need to talk about it further. Remember that dialogue is not decision-making. And that's a little bit why I touched on this slide here about know what kind of decision you're making. Because crucial conversations a lot of times are a little bit draining. It can take a lot of energy and you can fall into a few traps. One of them being you talk about it and, a lot of emotions get put out there, a lot of feelings and understanding, but then you don't talk about like, what does that mean we're going to do? And so you leave the conversation. And the example I have is one time I was talking to somebody who was upset about us going with American Publishing for some flyers or something like that. And I listened to them and they gave me their reasons and wanting local support and things like that. And I said, oh, I understand. And I thought we left the conversation with an understanding, but a month or so later, they called me again because these flyers went out and they were very upset, telling me I don't listen. And, I was just giving them false agreement. And then what I didn't establish was, okay, we have a contract. I can't do anything about this arrangement right now. When the contract is up, we'll revisit the conversation because at the moment, like I don't have the option to just decide not to do it. We'll do minimal investment. And then later when the contract expired, we went and revisited it, which kind of goes along with pay attention to follow through too. If you have a conversation about, hey, you're always late and then you agree to do these things so that you're on time and, the person's on time 3 times and then promptly they're late again, you need to pay attention to that follow through because otherwise it's going to feel like you just talk and there's no action.
So Daniel, we've kind of got to our session time right now, but if anyone has any questions, I would ask that they quick add them in the chat or reach out to myself or Daniel if you had any questions related. A quick question I can quick ask. The books that you mentioned at the first end, if there was one you could tell us which one to get out of the 3, which one should we get?
The Crucial Conversations is specifically about the talking.
Very good. Very good. And so thank you, Daniel. We appreciate your expertise in this area. I know our MASBO members really appreciate your time and we'll take away some valuable tools that you provided. And our next session for those that are here, it starts in 10 minutes at 2:50. Thank you again, Daniel.
Thank you very much. And I didn't skip over too much, so don't worry.